That rain scares people away. So he has to say when Christ returns, you better hope that his return isn't on a rainy day. You're going to miss liftoff. That's a beautiful song. I was thinking, I don't know where you got it from, but that was a song from '72, I remember. The Ambassador Chorale sang, and there's an actual video of that that's out there. It's a beautiful, beautiful song. They've done a great job on that. Ross Justin, yes. Anyway, that's pretty good. Hey, next time if y'all do that one again, let me know. We'll see if we can find the video, and while y'all sing it, we can play it in the background.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, double your pleasure. I got one announcement I do have to make. For those who saw News Nuggets and Insights, yesterday was not Veterans Day. I got to tell you a story. My phone started ringing at 6:30 this morning. I was getting emails last night. I said, oh, my goodness. Last Tuesday morning, I woke up and I heard Veterans Day on the news somewhere. I said, oh, man. I said, I cannot let this go. I didn't have Veterans Day in my News and Nuggets. I said, how did I miss that? Every year, that's important to us. So I got in and I started rearranging everything real fast. So I told our crew who was here, I said, look, this may be a little discombobulated because I made some last-minute changes for Veterans Day. Well, it's next Friday. That's how we missed it. So I told Audrey, I said, well, you usually catch those things when you proof for me. And she says, I proof your spelling, not what you put in. So anyway, if you're tuning in, it's next Friday. That gives us one more week to do some more videos for Veterans Day.
Incidentally, it's not Amos, it was Hosea. You said Amos on News Nuggets and Insights.
I did.
Yeah.
Okay.
He's a veteran. You corrected it.
Oh, okay. We got that. We'll get that corrected too, whatever that was. I used to tell everybody, so listen, if there isn't something in it that has to be worked on, it's not mine. All righty. Now that I got that out there. I mean, you got to laugh at yourself when you're doing so many programs. Like I was working on a newsletter, the quarterly, News and Nuggets, a sermon, and getting ready for the next sermon. All this stuff going on at one time, so it got by me. So anyway, senior moment, right? I tell people today that's a Biden moment. Yeah. I heard one, Bobby Weber told me this morning from Kennedy, John Kennedy from Louisiana. He says, if Biden was in charge of the Sahara Desert, they would run out of sand. I never heard that one before. And I told you, you'd hear it from here quick. All right. Where I'm at on time. Okay. All right. What I'm doing today is I'm doing part 2 of a two-part series that I did at the Feast of Tabernacles. But I'm not doing it in the same format like I did at the feast, where you have, full house and people packed in and the inspiration of an evangelistic style reach. I want this to soak in. I want this to be like a Bible study because I think it's one of the most important revelations that God's given to his church at the end time. Understanding the Shemitahs and how they're all funneled down. And if you saw part 1, I call it the law of, the sevens, or the Shemitah coming into a final period of time. And I believe God's given us enough information to say that's pretty accurate what God's been doing. Today I'm going to take us into a movement into the next phase of that, because now we are in that last, what I believe is the last 7 years of the period of time before the return of Jesus Christ. I call it the Shemitahs, gateway into the Millenium. And this is what I'm talking about. This is part 2, at the gate and looking in. And the reason I'm telling you about this, because the similarities, the parallels, and the events of the children of Israel after 40 years in the desert, they were on the Jordan River looking in at the Promised Land. You and I, in similarity, we're in the same boat. We're in the same boat because, see, the kingdom of God is not that far away. When we looked at the events and things that are taking place today, you have to admit there's something going on that we've got to be awful close. And I understand we don't know the exact time, but you cannot ignore all the events, all the news, the prophetic points that God put in his Bible, the news events that are taking place, and the parallels and dualities. Never before have we been in a time like we are today. So this is what I want to talk about, going into the Promised Land. The two-part sermon. The first part, we covered the complexity of what God has laid out for us to understand through his sevens. We went through the 7 days, 7,000 years, the 7 sevens of the Feast of the Weeks, leading to a Jubilee period. This time we're going to cover what God expects for us to enter the Promised Land. So this is really, really important, what we understand today. And I've tried to explain that it's not essential that you understand all the aspects of what we've laid out in all the series over the last 7 years, because there's over 70 hours worth of information there. Each one of those series, from the time we began in 2014, actually 15 is when we began to realize what was going on, till today, have built on the previous sermons in the topics that we've been covering. This one does the same thing. And this is why I feel like this is so important to us. So what we're going to do now is we're going to begin to look at the children of Israel and try to draw the analogies for us today for what God has left there. After 40 years, there came a day when the children of Israel stood on the edge of the Promised Land and they looked in. Let's take a moment and try to imagine what that was like. And we need to understand what they're going through, where they're at, and the events that were taking place when this happened. Before they actually crossed, they were told what they were going to do, and they said, get ready, in 3 days you're going to cross the Jordan. They remembered all the stories. They remembered the horror stories from the parents, the grandparents, and they were looking in. So what did God tell them when they were about to go in? Probably the one thing they never expected. The one thing they never expected. And that's where I want to pick up the story today. But before I cover that, let's take a moment to consider the events that are lining up that God has recorded for us to understand for our day. So let's go through that now and see where we're at and compare the two. Here's the reality. Just as they stood on the edge of the Promised Land and looked in, so do we. 2. There were two perspectives as they looked in. There would be those who would actually go into the Promised Land, and there would be one who didn't. All the rest had already died. For 40 years they were out in the wilderness, and everyone from 20 years of age and older, from those who came out of the Egypt, they're all dead. They're all in the wilderness. They're all gone. But there would still be one who wouldn't go in. Why is that important for you and I? Because there's a scripture that tells us what's going to go on for you and I. Revelation 14:13 says this, I heard a voice from heaven saying unto me, Right blessed are the dead, which die in the Lord from henceforth. That's pretty tough. What God just told us, just like he told the children of Israel, one of y'all is not going in. God's telling you and I, there are going to be those, like Moses, who are not going to live to the return of Jesus Christ, who are here today. But God looks at it different than we do. He said, blessed are those who die in the Lord from this day forward. So in other words, God's saying, look, you don't have to go through what everybody else is going to go through. Believe it or not, that's a merciful thing, what God's saying here. We have to be able to see things from the mind's eye of God to understand that those that we're praying for, those who are sick, those who are going to be dying, like Audrey's nephew, who was baptized a few weeks back, he just died last week. And God's saying, blessed are those. We're coming to a period of time that's going to be so bad that God says you're better off being dead than living through this. That's a merciful, loving thing. That means God's hand is on those people to let them go to sleep. Now, we can't imagine that. I mean, we have mothers and dads and children, relatives, friends. We pray before God. We beseech him every day. Please heal them. But God's going to say, no, I'm going to let them sleep. I'm going to let them sleep. We need to understand that. The second of the 2 points of going in is this. Behold, I show you a mystery. We shall not all sleep. In other words, there's going to be a category that's not in this category. They're going to go in. That means that those who are going in is going to be upon them the responsibility to do the job that God's called us to do. And it isn't just sitting around in church on Saturday having a great time doing potlucks. It's going to be tough. Behold, I show you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in the moment, the twinkling of an eye. At the last trump, for the trump shall sound, and the dead shall be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed. So there's our 2 categories. Just like the children of Israel as they're about to go into the promised land. So remember the question, what did God tell them before they're about to go in? It's found in Joshua chapter 1, verse 2. Probably the last thing they expected. Moses, my servant, is dead. All they knew was Moses. From the time God began using him in Egypt, all the way through, all the miracles that he brought through, that God did through Moses' hands, striking the rock, the water coming out, the food, everything that went through was through Moses. But you see, God couldn't have them going in leaning on an idol. How about the church? I'm sure you can pick up the parallel. People thought when the worldwide was in its heyday, we heard from Mr. Herbert that he was going to live to the return of Christ and he was going to lead everyone into the kingdom. You heard it. It's out there. It's on tape. How bold. God had a different plan. And to this day, many people in the bigger churches of God that came out of worldwide cannot let go of the doctrines and some of the things that was taught. In other words, when God says he's going to reveal information like he told Daniel in the end time, that means the knowledge that the church had when Mr. Herbert was alive was not yet given. So if you're going to hang on to that information, you're not going to be leading into the kingdom. How about that? That's that simple. In other words, if you're not willing to look to the scripture for revelation that God's given his church at the end time, you're going to be living with information that was for the time before you. Now that's a hard nut to crack for some people in some churches. But that is a fact. So now, what do you think the people felt who said, Moses is dead? Therefore arise, go over this Jordan, you and this people, and come to the land that I give you, even to the children of Israel. So they had to suddenly wake up and realize that someone else is taking them into that promised land. Moses stood on the edge of the promised land, and he also looked in. God actually was merciful enough to show him what was going to go on before he died. Look at Deuteronomy 34, verse 4 and 5. He said, this is the land which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, and I'm going to give it to your offspring, and I will let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not go over there. Now, I don't know how you read that, and I've just read over it, and I said, okay, I understand that. God brought him a mountain, he looked in, and let him go to sleep. But that's not what happened. I want to share something with you that I didn't quite understand. This did happen, but not the way I explained it happened. Remember, Moses was a friend of God. Those two spent a lot of time together. He was on a mountain 40 days and 40 nights twice. You know, they had this interaction of humor. Remember when the children of Israel would sin? And God says, Moses, your people down there, they've sinned. You got to go correct this. And Moses said, these are your people. You go fix it. The interaction between Moses and God was amazing. And Moses wanted to see his face, remember? And the longer Moses spent, Moses began to glow. In other words, the Spirit of God, the personality of God, flowed into Moses and it exhumed from him. He was beginning to mimic the look of greatness. And they had to put a veil over his face, remember? So you think God just brought him up there, said, there it is, go to sleep? I don't think so. I think I missed that. I don't know that I was ever taught what was going on, but the Bible kind of gives us some indication. So I'm just going to paraphrase a few thoughts that may or may not have happened. But I don't think God brought him up there and just let him up there take a look at the land, because see, Deuteronomy 34 gives us a little bit more information. I would think that that would be the last day that God was going to spend with him for several thousand years. I would think that he would probably want to spend some time with Moses. Don't you? I would think that he would meet him at the foot of the mountain. If I was going to be spending my last day with someone I really loved, I would want to spend as much time as I could. Share that last time together till they saw each other again. We've been through it. You've been through it with family. You know they're going to leave and you won't see them for another year. We see it at the feast every year when people hug and cry at the last day, and with the kids, they won't see their friends they just made for another year. So this is what Deuteronomy says. So Moses went up from the plains of Moab unto the mountain of Nebo to the top of Pisgah, and the Lord showed him all the land of Gilead unto Dan. So I would see him walking up to the mountain, and they would get to the highest point, and God begins to point out the land. He didn't just say, there's the promised land. Look at the way this is written. So he gets up there and he says, look, I'm going to show you something. You see over there, Moses? Way over there, that's going to be Gilead. And it's going to go all the way to Dan. And for the tribe of Dan, remember the promises I told of Dan? Well, it's going to go beyond that. And then he said, well, how about Naphtali? So you see what Naphtali is going to be? There's a map on this mountain, and it points with arrows. All these areas. It tells you how many miles it is, where you can see and how far you can see. And he says, in the land of Ephraim, and you know Ephraim is going to be a big land, Moses, because he's going to be on both sides of this river. He's going to cover a lot of land, and he's going to be blessed. And he goes on, he says, and then Manasseh, don't forget his brother. And then all the land of Judah, and Judah's going to be over there. And they would sit down and say, boy, you know, at the end days, there's going to be a lot of problems with Jerusalem. You see them have a little conversation about Jerusalem. And then he said, then all the land of Judah. See, all that over there is going to be Judah. All the way to the sea, all the way to the utmost of the sea. You see how it's written? It's not written as if there's the land of Judah, of the promised land. Okay, now it's time to go to sleep. It's written as if God's spending time with Moses. I didn't see that before. I honestly never saw it that way before. And I felt really bad, and I asked God to forgive me that I didn't take the time to look at his personality. Why is he doing that now? Why would God have the mercy to share his church that now? Because you see, we just read Revelation. And Revelation says, some of you are not going to be alive till I come. I'm going to have to let you sleep. But the same thing happened with Moses, the same love that God's going to give those people. So you need to understand. And we need to share that hope with your friends and your families. That if God doesn't let them live, he loves them enough that he's going to protect them, secure them. He's going to seal them till he returns. That hope you're going to have to instill in those, especially your family members who may not be in the church. Because I've done funerals, many, many funerals over the years. And I will watch those in the church and those out the church. And you see the hopelessness of those who don't understand the truth. They think they're in heaven, the one who's dead, but they pray they're not in hell. But they don't really know. Well, there's a hope that's built in the truth that God gives to his church. That they're just sealed, they're asleep till Christ returns. He goes on. He says, and over there in the south, see how far that is? Way down there in the south? Well, that's the plains in the valley of Jericho, and with the city of the palm trees. See, the palm trees is where they were going to be, had the 70 trees. And so all of that, he says, you see that way over there, Moses, that's where they're going to go to. And that's where they're going to stop on the seventh day. They're going to stop right there as they get ready for the eighth day. And he talked about what it represents. And all the way unto Zor. And the Lord said to him, this is the land that I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And I would think that they spent some time till the sun went down. As the sun was getting ready to go down, well, Moses, it's time to get some sleep. But when you wake up in the morning, I'm going to be right here. And you're going to be resurrected, and we're going to meet in the air, and I will stand on the Mount of Olives. I believe God spent the last day with Moses before he went and put him to sleep. I don't know that that story is true. I think it is. I think the more we see of God's personality, I think he shares more and more about what's inside of God. Because you see, God wants us to know. That's why he gave us Abraham and his son Isaac, that they had to live through. They literally had to live through the type of showing that the father was going to have to risk his son, put him to death, and lose him forever if he sinned, so that you and I can feel what the father felt. We have a hard time understanding things. If we can't understand the physical, God says you won't understand the spiritual. So he gives us the physical to understand the spiritual. Now let's go on. So now they stood on the edge of the promised land and they're looking in. For everyone 40 years and younger, they had never known anything other than in the wilderness. All they ever heard from their parents and grandparents is, we're going to the promised land. For 40 years. That's all they ever heard. You know, our children sometimes say, we've been hearing that since I was born. Christ is coming back. Don't they? Well, God says they're going to be scoffers in the last days. He said, know this first, that there's going to come scoffers in the last days, walking after their own lust. Our own children sometimes, who need a calling. They have to have their own calling. God does protect them through the family, through the parents. He does protect them. But they can't go into the kingdom and become a spirit being on your coattail. They have to accept Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior, just like you did. And do you know how hard it is for the children who grow up in the church? That second generation? All they've ever known was this. All they've ever heard is like the children in the wilderness, you know, we're going to the promised land. So, well, when's Christ coming back? So generations of Christians from the time of Christ have said the thing. Paul said it. We which are alive thought in his day. Peter, even John, all thought the same thing, saying, where's the promise of his coming? Since the fathers fell asleep, all things continued as they were from the beginning of creation. So that ain't never been the same. And I hear church people today in churches scattered saying, well, we've all heard that before. When we do, and I do a hard-hitting message, an in and I do warning, and I do prophecy, and I hear church people say, oh, we've heard that for 30, 40 years, 50 years. Somebody been in the church for 60 years. Oh, they've been saying that for 60 years. Yeah, but they've never had what's there today. It has never been what is there today. That was the point of part one of this sermon. That God has taken the time from creation to lay out the solar system, the planets, everything that's out there to point us into a final period of time, because he says, I'm going to tell you before I do it. And so he showed us where we are today. Standing on the edge, looking in. They were living with the memories that their parents had told them from the report of the spies that they would have to encounter. So the stories lived on about the giants that were in there. Now they got to go in there without Moses. They're going to have to go fight the giants. And they could see the walls of Jericho from that Jordan River. They could see how high it was and the armies that were there. So they knew what they had to go against was going to be tough. The church says, we've all heard this before. The family members, we've heard this before. We too have a cloud of witnesses that have gone before us. We have the living testimony of Jesus Christ and all his prophecies. How could we ever say, we've heard this before? Do we dare move into the camp of Peter's warning there'll be scoffers in the last days? In the insight into the Shemitahs and the times we live in, by understanding the Shemitah cycles that are connected to historical events that fall on the Sabbath and the ninth of Av, the Shemitah cycle, the Sabbath, and the ninth of Av, we find that they point to the harbingers of warnings and doom. I could not tell you that 6 months ago. I did not understand that. It was here when I was doing a sermon or an announcement that I would be doing the sermon on the ninth of Av. And I said, I don't know if I've ever done the sermon on the ninth of Av before. And then I realized that night when I went home, I don't know, I never looked. You see, it wasn't an awareness that was important years ago. So when I began looking, all of this information began to open up. All this information that church never had 30 years ago or 40 years ago or last year. Putting all this together. The Shemitah cycles today and the world events are all pointing to difficult, catastrophic times that are ahead. They're all leading to the time of Jacob's trouble. So where are we now? This was the cycle that I've showed you last week. I'll cover a little bit of it today, not much. We went through it on the ninth of Av. These are Shemitah cycles. At the end of those 7 years, every one of them falling at or on the ninth of Av on the Sabbath day. So let's pull that aside and let's begin to take a look at this. We believe that 2015 was a pivotal moment in time toward the return of Jesus Christ. I didn't understand why, except to understand that in that cycle of blood moon tetrads, that there were warning periods. That was the 8th time. And the only thing I understood when I began looking at that was the 8th was always the beginning. And as I studied into it, it became clear that what God was not bringing an end at that time, as many people thought that they were going to be raptured away before the return of Jesus Christ. What was important was to understand it was the beginning of the end time. It was only beginning to move into a period of time where God would begin to bring everything down and leading up to it. That was in 2015. That's the very year that the United States turned its back on God and opened gay marriage. And look where we've been from there. In just 7 years, look how deteriorated the nation has become. Now we've already reached the point that they're promoting pedophile. They're promoting it. And if you don't go along with it, they're talking about arresting you. It was also a year that the Pope went down and he signed an accord with the PLO against Israel. He also came to America, as we've covered so many times in the past, where he laid out his 2030 agenda, which was the pivotal moment at that time. It was also the beginning of the rise of the Holy Roman Revival. All of that in 1 year. Actually, within a matter of about 6 months. 6 months. So it began opening up the 7-year cycles that we hadn't spent a lot of time on before, even though the church has always understood a land rest. So I've put in 7 of them here as I began to look through, and as I explained last time what they all stood for. I don't have time to do those today. So let me center on that period of time, 2015. Excuse me. God's plan of 7,000 years for mankind. So when we look at it, it's built on the 7 days of a week that we understood a day as 1,000 years. All of that's pretty simple as well as understood. 2015 began to move into a pivotal period of time. What we didn't look at in 2015 is we didn't look back. What got us to that period of time? We always looked forward, not where we're at. So we never understood that we were in the middle of a cycle of importance in 2015. That cycle in 1994 began in the fall of 1987, because you see you have to have 6 years till that 7th year. And I bring that up today because we got an email from someone who sent me a question. He said, but there's only 6 cycles there. Because you go in, he went into the middle between 94 to 2001 is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Not realizing what I did is I picked up on the 7th year because I was focused on the Shemitah year. But that was the 7th of the first cycle. So there was a cycle before that, and that's why I put that in today. To answer that question. 2015, when we look at it as a day as 1,000 years, and we look at the 4th cycle of 7, they all fall at the same time. This pictured the pointing to the beginning and the return of Jesus Christ. leading us up into where we're going to be into those horrible times that's coming. This is the fourth Shemitah of the final Jubilee period, parallel to the fourth day of the week and the fourth year of God's plan. Why is this so important? This had to be laid out from the beginning and before creation. When God sat down on his drawing plan, you go back and read Job. And when he told Job, where were you and he begins laying out all the things that he laid out. And then Job realized how little he really was. When God decided to do this, he had to lay things out in a fashion so you and I don't fail. That's how important this is. That's why I'm telling you today, this is the most important sermon we've had to date, because it pinpoints where God has brought us to and what God has done. So what he did before he actually recreated Genesis 1:1, he had to lay all the constellations out. He had to put everything in its orbit. He had to lay all of this out that's going to last for thousands of years, and it had to fall in place in a specific period of time, thousands of years ahead. That's amazing what God did that. 1 Corinthians 10 says, why did he do it? He says, so that we don't make the same mistakes. Because he said, if you fail, he said, if there is none at the end time, everyone would be lost. So he laid everything out for you and I to succeed. To succeed. So now, let's look at where we are. 4,000 years, in the 4,000th year cycle, what do we have? The beginning of Christ's first return. By 2030 or 31, I bring in both because people want to argue dates. I don't have to argue that date. We'll know in a couple of years where we're at. But the point is, it's where we're going. Is that's also the time that Christ came to this earth. The fourth day of the year, the 4,000th year of God's plan. Dead center of the week. He said he'd be cut off in the midst of the week. So even with all of that, God had to lay it out from before creation so that everything would fall perfectly in place. And then he put the star alignment, I'm not bringing that in today, to fall in that period of time here. And believe it or not, from the beginning of that Shemitah cycle to 2017 is 3.5 years. It's right in the middle of the 7-year cycle from the beginning of the blood moons. Another perfect alignment. So, wow. Try to comprehend what God had to do to make all this work. So when somebody says, we don't want to talk about prophecy, you have just ignored what Jesus Christ said. It is the spirit of prophecy. That's the testimony of Jesus Christ. If you don't understand prophecy, you have ignored Jesus Christ's words. It sounds so simple. And it perplexes me when people in the churches of God, the Church of God community, I'm telling you, they don't want to talk about prophecy. It's troubling. We need to pray that God can give us an open door to help understand, to get the people past the period of the Moses period, to understand what God's taken us to. It's essential that we understand. But then, after 2,000 years, the prophecy here in Hosea says that. After two days, which is 2,000 years, he says that God's going to restore us, and in the third day, we're going to dwell in his face. All right, there's the prophecy. He will raise us up, and we shall live in his sight. There's only one period of time that God talks about that happens. It's called the Millenium. So there we are, the 2030 agenda. Why did the Pope pick 2030? Because Satan knows he has but a short time. So what Satan was doing, he's marked his period that he knows that this time Christ is going to be coming back somewhere about here. We also know God says he's going to cut time short, or he could extend it. This is only according to prophecies. I'm not setting dates. I'm not setting the dates. But when you put all these things together, this is what lies up. So now we're in the millennial reign, the 1,000 years, in the third day. Following that, after the 7-year cycle, what comes after the 7,000 years? A new heaven and a new earth. That's 50. That's 50. That's the new heaven and new earth. It's coming in. You see how these things line up? It's really imperative we understand that. So now here we are, 2038 there. We're at the last 7 years of the Jubilee cycle. In this Jubilee year cycle, we don't know exactly what's happening in the next 7 years, do we? This is where we left off in part 1, right here. But we do know we have to go through the seals. And it is possible we have begun laying out the beginning of the first 4 seals already. I won't say it's not there yet because there's a lot going on. But I'm going to show you where we are today looking into the promised land from where we're at. So now we've got the question mark. So Genesis 42, verse 1 and 2 gives us some information that aligns where we are today. And I believe this is purposeful for what God put in his Bible for you and I today, looking forward. Now when Jacob saw, this is 42, verse 1 and 2, when he saw that there was corn in Egypt, Jacob said to his sons, "Why do you look upon one another?" He said, "Behold, I've heard that there's corn in Egypt. Get down there and go buy us some, that we may live and not die." Boldness. There's an assurity in his voice. He knows that, look, just get us through this year. We'll have rain next year, and everything's going to be fine. Just like people in the news are telling us today. It's going to be fine. We're going to get past this. And they all want to sell you something, especially if you're in the financials. And they're all going to tell you why this one stock is going to get you through it. When everything settles down, you're going to be in better shape than everybody else because it's all going to come back just like it always did. I don't think so this time. I think this is going to drag on. And there are going to be periods ups and there'll be periods of downs. But in each period, if you look forward, it's going to get worse and worse and worse. So that's Genesis 42, 1 and 2. Next chapter. Next chapter, we have the famine was still. It was sore in the land now. Now they're in the second year without rain. And it came to pass when they had eaten the corn that they had out of Egypt, the father said, "Go again and buy us a little food." See the wording, what God's laid out here. Wording is critical when you're understanding prophecy, what God's laying out. Is here, they're saying, listen, we don't have a lot left over. Go see if there's anything down there. Buy us a little bit so we can live. This is the second year. This is the first and second year of the famine, is what we're looking at here. So now, if we are in the last 7 years, what has God just showed us there? So what we're looking at right now is in 2023, in 2024, I believe with all my heart now is that what we're looking at is Genesis 42 and Genesis 43. But I'm not just telling you because I think that's my opinion. I'm going to show you where we are in current events that are all pointing to this as disasters coming. I don't care what the news is telling you. See, you're in an election year. After Tuesday, you can expect news to begin to change over the next few months because, you see, they don't want you to know how bad things really are. People in stores are telling them, we can't get our orders filled right now. There's things coming that we are not prepared for as a people. Then there are 5 years ahead. I believe God's showing us that it's going to get worse and worse over the next 2 years. So you better continue to prepare and store. It's going to cost you more every time you do. If you find sometime there's a sale, man, go grab it. Do everything within the power that God gives you, leaning on Him, because this isn't what's going to save you, storing, but it will help. It will help because we have 5 more years, the last Jubilee cycle. So now let's move that away and look what the Bible says. There's a period of time that's coming. Luke 21:25, we've covered this in the Roaring Sea sermon. It says there'll be signs in the sun and in the moon. Isn't that amazing? We started this with signs in the moon, the blood moon tetrad. That's what put us on track. God said that it would be signs in the sun and in the moon in distress of the nations. That word distress is from Strong 640, aporia, in a quandary. It means no way out. In other words, what Luke 21:25 says, the planet's going to find itself in a condition it can't fix it. Sea and waves roaring, which we covered at another time, so I won't go into that. So where are we now? The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres says, our world is in peril. The UN chief says, opening in a general address. He says, we're gridlocked in a colossal dysfunction. He went on to say, our world is in peril. It's paralyzed. He just said what the prophecy said is coming. You can't fix the problem. It's paralyzed right now. Just after that, Biden warns that the world would face Armageddon if Putin uses a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine. He said, we have not faced the prospect of Armageddon since Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now there's a whole bunch of leaders saying that all around the world. So let's look at now transforming into the next 7 years. Into that period leading into false Christ, famines, pestilence, and death, which a lot of churches understand that, and they've been preaching on it long and hard on the internet, if you've been looking at the internet. He says, there went out another horse, was red, and power was given him to do what? Take peace from the earth. I believe where God has showed us now, as we move into these periods of time, showing the first 4 seals, the first thing that has to happen is this. As we move into this next 7-year period, there's not a place on the planet that is at peace. It has reached the point that God has taken the peace from this planet. So now let's look at the world conditions as we transition into the next 7 years. We're standing on the edge of eternity. We're looking at the promised land. What do we see? I'm just going to go through some kind of quick because of time to show you what we're looking at right now as we move in. This is from Watch. This is the WorldNet Daily. China expert says we're at the most dangerous moment in history. Now, you got to be pretty bold to make a statement like that. When he said that, he's looking at the past. He understood the Korean War, Vietnam War. He understood World War I and World War II. This time is different. This time we're at the nuclear age. This time if a world war breaks out and they begin using weapons that they've created, it's the end of the planet unless God stops it. He said we're at the most dangerous moment in history. Looking into the promised land over the next 7 years, we're at the beginning, we're at the most dangerous time going forward. He said a leader more powerful than Mao, and Mao, millions died at his hands. A leader more powerful than Mao is mobilizing the Chinese people for war right now. He said, with 3 strongman leaders of unstable nuclear weapon nations, 3 of these guys who are running these nations, they're all unstable and they all have nuclear weapons. He said there's never been a time more dangerous than this moment in history. He warned the China watcher. This was from Gordon G. Chang. Now, I don't know if you know who he is, but Gordon G. Chang actually lived in China and reported on them for the last 20 years. So he knows what he's looking at. He knows what he's talking about, even though they don't want to listen to him. He knows what he's talking about. Our own Fed Secretary, Jerome Powell, says, get ready to sacrifice. He said that a few months ago. Without his knowledge or even understanding, he just delivered one of the most prophetic announcements to date. That was back then. Joe Biden just did one, and now we're seeing everybody making statements that are prophetic. First thing he says, we're living through the end of abundance. Now, I mean, this is the president of France. What else did he say? He said the last time that happened in Europe, World War II started. Then what did he say? He went on to say one more thing. He says, get ready for sacrifices ahead and the end of abundance. Well, that's where we're at. That's what the Bible just told us. That's what God says, chapter 42 and 43 of Genesis. Go buy us a little food. Right now you're complaining about prices for food. Next year you might be complaining about food. Where's it at? Talk to a restaurant who can't get their supplies and fix their meals. Talk to the groceries who got to leave their shelves empty because they can't get there. Now we're talking about diesel. We don't have enough diesel. You think gas prices are high. Wait till there's no diesel. I want to see the Biden administration run a USS aircraft carrier without fossil fuel. How about one of these jets that are up there? What are they going to do? Put a balloon on it and float it over there? Think about it. You cannot run a world without fossil fuel. We're going to transform to what? There's nothing out there to transform to. Have you seen how many panels you got to have to run one huge building for solar panels? You got to have acres and acres and acres. And where are you going to put windmills in the middle of major cities and panels? Try to put them here in New Orleans. There's nowhere to put them. We'll put them out in the swamp. We'll put them on boats. Can you understand where we're at? God has taken the minds of our leadership and He's given dysfunction. They can't make decisions. Going on. We're knocking on famine's door. The UN food chiefs of the world said, the United Nations. He says, we're in a perfect storm on top of a perfect storm. The news isn't telling you anything about this. Did you know that they didn't even announce that Benjamin Netanyahu is back in power in Israel? They didn't even want to announce that. God put him back in power because they need someone who's strong, who's going to be able to bring about God's plan at the end time and rile up the Arabs, to bring about the wars that's going to be coming, the armies surrounding Jerusalem. It had to have that kind of personality, strength. You can't even find it in the news, what's going on out there. Why? Because we're fighting woke. We're fighting stupid things in our nation. So he urged the donors and the billionaires, you're going to have to sacrifice and come up with money. He said, otherwise there's going to be chaos all over the world. Oh yeah, that's where we're at. That is exactly where we are. The indicators, he said, they're not looking good as the World Trade Organization says, get ready for global recession. Well, we're there. Global recession is coming. And it's coming to the United States. They've been able to put it off because they're robbing from the future. But they can only rob so much. And then it's going to collapse again. It's coming. Food shortages. Look at this one. Food shortages are far worse than you're being told. These are headlines around the world. And I heard churches of God's ministers saying, we don't live on headline news. Well, you better start. You better start living on headline news, because this is just one agency. These are people who are running the planet, who are putting out the headlines. They're trying to tell people what's coming, and they don't want to listen. But God says, don't you be like them. He says, I laid it out for you so you can be protected and be prepared. He said there's clear indications that some of these famines could begin as early as October to December. And some nations are facing that right now. Not the United States, but there are some nations. Stock market lost $9 trillion this year is a minimum. I don't know how much more they lost, but there's been at least 9. Some people say over $10 trillion already. Putin has already annexed the Ukraine, parts of the Ukraine with the war that's over there. Talk about World War II, that's how it started. Hitler started annexing. He started annexing just a little bit of here, a little bit of Poland, but he began taking. Right after the annexation, Zelensky pushed to accelerate the application for NATO into the membership. If that happens, which it will because we're insane. This application, the collective article, means that once he becomes a member of NATO, all nations of NATO have to step in and fight. That means we're now at war with Russia. You realize what's going on here? All right, let's move on, because I'm using too much time through this, I know it, but I need to bring this out, so I hope you bear with it if I run late. I don't want to rush this through, because this is an important sermon. It's an important sermon, but I'm not going to spend that much time going that late. Right before the feast, North Korea, little rocket man, began firing numerous missiles over Japan. Then they sent a dozen jets to the South Korean border, and all of a sudden warnings went out, and the South Koreans sent jets out. This was before the feast. Yesterday, South Korea scrambles jets after detecting North Korean military flights near the border. More tensions. Look what they did this time. North Korea fired more than 80 rounds of artillery into the waters near Japan, or into Taiwan, and they launched multiple missiles into the C-130, including a possible failed intercontinental ballistic missile. Suppose that thing was armed. When it fell over and hit Taiwan. We're in a new game if that happens. In addition, South Korea's military said it scrambled fighter jets after detecting 180 North Korean military flights heading to their border. 180 of them heading to South Korea. They're pushing South Korea to make a mistake and fire on them. That's what they're doing. South Korea don't know what's going on. All of a sudden they hit the radar and there's 180 fighter jets heading your way? That sounded pretty serious. So that happened on Friday. North Korea aircraft flew north of the so-called tactical action line. In other words, there's an area that you don't go beyond this, and South Korea won't go beyond this. Well, they went beyond that. So South Korea is thinking they're coming in this time. And so all of that's taking place. So South Korea scrambles 80 aircraft. How much did you hear in the news about this yesterday? Didn't have enough time. Got to talk about that election. So now, we're turning to a Dust Bowl. Isn't it interesting there was a Dust Bowl here in America before the wars began? See, the United States is coming down just like it did pre-World War II. Now, the Democrats now are saying that the Republicans, they're reversing everything that happened and putting the conservatives and the Christians into the category as the Hitler people. So that's interesting how they can do that. How the Republicans now are controlling the media like Hitler did. Really? Who are they controlling? Maybe 2 networks, 3 networks?
Not even that.
Not even that. You're right, not even that. Can you believe I was kidding Audrey this morning, she was talking about something on the news, and I said, there you go again. You're listening to your eyes. Don't worry about what you're seeing. Believe what they're telling you. We kind of mock those things at home because it's so ridiculous. So let's quickly go through this. Europe's worst drought in 500 years. The world's largest economies are being hurt by the droughts. Nothing in history comes close to the brutal heat wave in China. Headline news. These are real events taking place. They're not headlines. China's water crisis could trigger global catastrophe. The U.S. economy is dead in the water. This just came out yesterday or the day before by Steve Forbes. So the U.S. economy is dead in the water despite the GDP growing in the third quarter, Steve Forbes said. He noted that hard times are coming given inflation is still high and the global energy crisis. That's the reality of the world we're living in today. That's where we're at. So now, knowing these things, what do? God says, be not troubled. Matthew 24, verse 6. We've heard that verse before, right? And you shall hear wars and rumors of wars. Well, you're living through that. See that you be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. Well, so what he's showing us is that these things are going to happen first. They've happened before. They're going to happen exactly the same way again. That word troubled means, it's from Strong's 2360, throeo, O-E-O, means to frighten. In other words, don't be frightened when this comes to pass. God said, I'm telling you in advance. And in 2 Thessalonians, he says, I beseech you by the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and by the gathering together to him, that you soon not be shaken or troubled. Same word. In other words, you don't have to be frightened what's coming. God's telling you, it's like the children of Israel. When he went in, you don't have to be afraid of what's over there. I'm going to lead you. I'm taking care of you. And I'm going to bring you to the promised land. So what is God telling us today? Same thing. He's telling us, look, you don't have to be worried about all of that. You trust me. So I'm telling you, God says you trust him. He's going to take you to where he wants you to be. And you're going to fall in one of 2 categories. God's going to let you go to sleep, like he did Moses, or you're going to live through it. It's that simple. I wish it was that simple. Isaiah 41. But look what God says in Isaiah 41. He says, but you, Israel, you're my servant. We're Israelites. Spiritual. We had a spirit of God that makes us a part of God's family. You're a spiritual Israelite. Actually in physical, but we carry the spirit of God. We are part of that family. He says, you're my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, the seed of Abraham, my friend, to whom I have taken from the ends of the earth and called you from the chief of men. Therefore, he said to them, you're my servant. I have chosen you, and I've not cast you away. Remember that when you go through times in the next 7 years or whatever it is before God comes back, when Jesus Christ stands on this planet, I didn't cast you away, he says. He called you for a purpose. He said, fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you, and I will help you. Yes, I will uphold you with the right hand of my righteousness. That's a promise. We don't have to be afraid. We can walk boldly before this world and say, I'm a son of God. There's nothing you can do unless God lets you do it. That's what he's telling us in Isaiah. Conditions entering the kingdom. Now he's showed us a couple things. The conditions. This is Mark Twain, and this is him looking into the promised land. This is after 400 years in a Gentile nation's hands. 400 years. That's in the 1800s. Mark Twain said in Palestine, he said, it's a hopeless, dreary, heartbroken land. He said, Palestine sits in sackcloth and ashes. It broods over the spell of a curse that has withered its fields and fettered its energies. That's what Deuteronomy says, and Leviticus says. You don't obey me, that's what the land's going to look like. That's where Satan brought it to, where God had to recreate it back to Genesis period. So what we're looking at is Satan trying to do that again right now. He goes on to say, he said, it's a desolate country. Saul's rich enough, but is given wholly over to weeds. It's a silent, mournful expanse. So when he saw it, he said, these are real pictures, by the way. These were pictures that he took in the late 1800s when he went into Palestine. He said, man, what a mess it had become. He said, the desolation is here. Not even the imagination can grace with the pomp of life in action. Now, that's a drawing there. That's not a real picture. But basically, that's what he was looking at as he went in. Why did I tell you in part one about the physical and showing you duality of the events that was taking place? The Shemitahs and the Sabbaths. The historical dates of the Sabbath and the ninth of Av and the Shemitah are so important that we didn't understand how important they were because they pointed us to this period of time right now. And he gave us the physical to understand the spiritual. So in 1917, we entered World War II. What I didn't know till a few weeks ago, we entered on the Passover. It was the Passover day that we entered World War I. So wow, that was Passover. So now these historical dates, beginning in September the same year, after the Day of Atonement, we entered into the beginning of a 7-year cycle that led us to the period of time that we're looking at, a spiritual cycle that you and I live in today. At sunset on December 8th, 1917, prophecy launched the fig tree season. People want to argue when the fig tree season was. I think we found it. Watch this. I think we found it. It began in 1917. In 1917, on December 8th at sunset, all the way through the night, it was a prophetic fulfillment coming to pass where all the Turks left Jerusalem. They just walked out for fear. And we see this event in Haggai coming to pass. God says when this, if you go back and read the chapter, God says when he began to do this, in other words, when he laid the foundation of his temple. What is the end time temple? It's not the building, it's the people. So when he began to pull his people back into Jerusalem, he says, from the time I begin, I will not stop till it's completed. That means till Christ returns. What happened that day? General Allenby marched into Jerusalem after 400 years. How long were the children of Israel captive in Egypt? 400 years. Exodus says they came out exactly 430 years. If we go forward 30 years, in 1947, the UN formally put the papers to recognize Israel. 30 years later, 430 years. Everything lined out. Remember I told you at the beginning how important the timing is? Because you see, God put all this in place before Genesis 1:1. Otherwise, none of it would happen. And then he brought it to pass. So now we go through the cycles. So we go all those cycles from 1945, 52, 59, 66. There's the 7 cycles, just like I showed you in the 7 cycles that we're in right now. 66 and 67. So what are we looking at here? So we begin to put this thing in a picture. If I get my clicker to work, There. So Hitler began his first tout for power 1924. 1931, he began to rise in power. He took control in 1933. By 1938, I believe World War II started because that's when the annexation began, even though the world says 1939, when the actual war began after Poland. You know, I dare anyone challenge Ukraine, say that you're not in a war right now because he only annexed your country. It's not a real war. It was a real war back then, too, if you lived in those countries. 1945, that's the fourth period. So somewhere between 1945 and 1952, there was enough nuclear weapons on the earth to destroy all mankind. Remember what God says, that he had to cut time short? Look what we're looking at here. There's a blood moon period right up in there also. I believe that was telling us when that time was, right there. That was the blood moon period. So it goes on, Matthew says, unless time was cut short. He had to cut that war short because if it kept going in 1952, by the time 52 came, they would have blown everybody off the planet. It was cut short. You see the parallels? Do you see how important it is? How do we know? The heavenly signs. He points them out. Let's go a little bit further. How about in 66? What happened in 66 and 67? Jerusalem, Six-Day War. They took control over all of Jerusalem. What's the type? Is Jesus Christ coming back? Where's he going to be? On the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. In 67 is 1 year later. 67. Oh yeah, Jubilee. Jubilee, 1967. That's the 50th year. Now, this is where God's taking us. The planet's going to look a lot like Mark Twain saw. But this is how it is in Israel's hands. Same land in Israel's hands. That's what God's going to do. The land's being restored. He said it's a fruitful land, a redeemed nation, Ezekiel 36. Look at here. He said, Israel in all my glory. Look at all that land. That's Israel today. Can you believe what's going on from the way it was? He said, I will even make a way in the wilderness and the rivers in the desert. Israel's getting ahead of time. They knew the times were coming, so they're building desalination plants, and they got enough water, they're selling it to their neighbors today. The rest of the world is starving for water. They're selling it to their neighbors in an area that was a desert. Isn't it amazing what God can do? So here we are today. Here we are today. We're at the gate. Everything I shared with you today is pointing us into the gate. That gate is the open door that Jesus Christ has called you and I to be a part of. And we're looking in. We're looking to that time when Jesus Christ is going to stand on the Mount of Olives. He said, when you see these times come, he said, hold your head up high. He says, because you know salvation is drawing near. So now, look what 1 Corinthians 10 says, and never forget this. Now, all these things happen to them for examples, and they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come. Everything we see, this is in specific, is talking about all the Israelites in Egypt. But in general, everything written, and you can use that in other scriptures, everything that's been written and recorded is for you and I so we don't fail. So that means when God was in his throne room and he began to lay out the plans for mankind, he put everything in its place. The moon, the sun, the orbits, the alignments. You have to have a perfect alignment to get a blood moon. It has to be exactly perfect at an exact time. We have another one, blood moon, coming Tuesday. And most of the earth's going to be able to see it. It's going to happen before the election. Blood moons are not good signs. It's usually disastrous. I don't know how this election is going to be. I won't try to prophesy, but no matter who gets in, they don't have the answer. Only Jesus Christ has the answer. That means you and I have to preach a warning message to get people to repent. To repent. Today, God has called you and I. He has given us the same responsibility that he gave to Joseph. What is that responsibility? I'm just about to wrap this up now. Genesis 45, verses 5 through 7. He says, now therefore, this is Joseph talking to his family. Remember, they sold him into captivity. For a lot of years he was there. He says, now therefore be not grieved nor angry with yourselves that you sold me here, for God did send me before you to preserve life. You ever wonder why God called us? It's right there. That's it, right there. God called you and I to work together as a team, all of God's churches, to work in unison. We don't have to be under the same umbrella. We have to respect each other's work because God says, I got a church here. The 7 churches in Revelation shows us that. But we have to work in unison for the return of Christ. This is why you've been called, to preserve life. Verse 6. He said, for these 2 years, remember Genesis 42 and 43? All right, this is chapter 45 now. He said, these 2 years there has been famine in the land, and there are yet 5 years in which there shall be neither earing or harvest. So at the end of 23 and 24, we still got at least 5 years in this cycle. What's next? The Bible doesn't give a lot of specifics from that period on, unless you go to Revelation. And Revelation tells us what's going to happen. I believe we're in the period of Genesis 42 and 43 right now. I believe the world has reached the point that there's no more peace in it. And God's shown us one more time, get yourselves prepared, mentally and spiritually. And then do whatever you can for food, because that food's not going to save you for 7 years. It won't do it. You're going to have to trust God to get you through it. Because if you trust in that, you will seek to save yourself and you will lose your life. But if you trust God, because see, you can't have enough. Because everybody around you who's not storing, you're going to let your family starve while you eat? No, you can't do that. You can't put enough aside. But it can help get you through. And if God sees in your heart you trust in Him, He will give you what you need and get you through. I got a feeling by the end of the 7 years, we're all going to be a lot thinner. Even me. I really do. I'll tell you a funny story. I know I'm a few minutes over, but when I was in the hospital, they only gave me so much time. They said, if I don't pull through tonight, that you're not going to make it. You know, you're going to be in the ventilator and you ain't going home. That night I got hungry. I was still, and about 11 o'clock I said, can you bring me something to eat? I was kind of hungry. You know, you die, and he said, can you bring me something to eat before I go into that mask? That's a true story. So they brought me some pudding that I could eat some pudding. You know, it's like I must be an insane idiot here. They tell you you're going to die. Well, good. Give me a last meal. That's a true story. So the nurse was on and went out and brought me a couple puddings. I ate my puddings and they put my mask on, so they helped me live through the night. That's silly. I know it's a true story. All right, the last thing here. God sent me before you to preserve you a posterity in the earth and to save your lives by great deliverance. You see, we're going to do everything we can, but there's going to come a great deliverance. And Jesus Christ is going to be the one that saves those that He has called. But we have been called to prepare the way, like a John the Baptist, for the return of Jesus Christ. The Shemitahs, the alignment of the sevens, everything that's been put in the Bible has been put there for one reason, for us, so we don't fail. I hope you take this sermon and you look at it more than once and put it in your minds and your heart and turn your life over to Jesus Christ for Him to bring you to salvation.